Welcome everyone to the meeting on how to slay the MCAT. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we still have to take it for some reason. But we've gathered a bunch of resources that hopefully can help you because it is a little bit difficult to navigate. There's a lot of material on this test. Just real quick for who we are, we're the UW Pre-Physician Scientist Club. If you want to follow this QR code, you can follow us on social media. And we're designated for helping meet people interested in a physician scientist career. So that's people who are interested in pursuing significant amounts of time in research and medicine. And there are multiple ways of doing that, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in the slides. But you could do an MD, you could do a DO, you could do a combined MD PhD, and you could become a physician scientist, someone who's interested in science and medicine. Here is the speaker slide. Can everyone introduce themselves?
So my name is Madeline. I graduated in 2019 with a degree in biology. You can see the score breakdown below, and we'll kind of talk about how scores are broken down a little bit later in the slides. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm going through the application process right now, so I do know kind of some of the timeline details. If you're interested, shoot me an email.
Hi everyone, my name is Manif. I also graduated in 2019 with a degree in microbiology from the University of Washington. There's my score breakdown. I will be applying this upcoming cycle. So I also can talk a little bit about timelines, dates, things like that.
Hey everyone, you should know me by now. I'm Daniel. I graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in biochemistry in 2019. And I took the MCAT during the pandemic, which was unique. But I also took it, I also retook it outside the pandemic, so before everything hit. So I have some unique experience in how to improve your score. And if you want to know anything like that, you can feel free to shoot me an email. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to cover. So first, we're going to just cover the intro, like the structure of the MCAT, the scoring, and then setting a goal. Then some prereqs that you should take, like classes. And then study resources. This is probably the most helpful. It has lots of books, flashcards, practice tests, and AAMC materials, and all of this stuff is linked. The schedule, this is like how to organize your time and budget your time to study efficiently. Next, we're going to move on to taking the actual real exam, which is pretty stressful, but we're going to talk about stress management, how to stay calm. And then lastly, we're going to talk about getting results. So this could either be one of the best days of your life or one of the worst days of your life. We're going to cover test release, and what happens if you need to retake. It's not the end of the world. So real quick, here's the introduction.
So just a brief overview on the structure of the MCAT. You can advance slide, please. So it is a multiple choice test. There are passage-based sections where there are questions that go along with a reading passage, and then there are also freestanding standalone questions. And it's broken down into 4 main sections. The first of which, if you want to hit the animate, Daniel, cool. Is the chemical and physical foundations. And this is really chem phys heavy, hence the CP, but really you're going to see biochem and bio kind of mixed in there as well. And it's 95 minutes long, 59 questions total, 44 of which are passage-based, 15 are standalone. And then the second section is the CARS section. And you can take an optional 10-minute break. I would recommend always taking the breaks just to take a second, get out of the room, get some water. I think it's a really good habit. Just kind of reset your section or reset yourself before the next section. And so the CARS is mainly a reading comprehension based section. And so you don't need any prior knowledge for this section. It is strictly reading a passage and then answering those questions about your understanding. And after this one, you get a 30-minute break. They have added the 30-minute break back in. During COVID, they had reduced it, I believe, down to 10 minutes. And they had taken out some of those extraneous questions that kind of condensed the exam, but we are back up to the full 7.5-hour test. And so then after that break, you've got the biology heavy section. And this one you're most likely seeing biochem, but then you're also seeing, gen chem and OChem. And next section, after a 10-minute break, you've got your psychology, sociology section. And again, kind of like all the other ones, these ones are 59 questions, 44 are passage-based, and then 15 standalone. A couple things to note about the test structure. This year, they're doing 2 exams per day. There's a morning one and an afternoon one, and there's 3 separate registration days. So depending on when you want to take the exam, and if you want a certain time, you're better to register early to kind of get your, if you're a morning person, get that morning time. If you're an afternoon studier, get that evening exam. And then the last important thing to note is that most schools have a 3-year expiration date. So depending on when you're wanting to apply to medical school, you kind of want to base off when you're going to be taking that exam. So that's super important. And then scoring scheme. So your number correct is what the score is based off of. The incorrect answers don't count against you. So you're always better off taking an educated guess. And then they scale that, and that's in order to compensate for the test version variations, because everyone gets slightly a different exam. And so in order to kind of regulate between versions, they scale the score. And you're graded from 118 to 132 in each of those 4 sections. So you'll see here the graph of each of the 4 sections broken down. And then they put it together into a score that compiles to be 472 to 528. And it's based on a normal curve with the median mean being around 500, as you can see here. And so this graph is based on, I believe, the data from 2017, 2018, 2019. And you can see that it is a normal distribution over that combined score. And then if you go to the next slide, I think this is an important thing to kind of take note of as you're sort of setting your goal for where you want to hit. For example, if you are setting a goal for, you want to be in the 90th percentile, you're needing to hit around a 514, 515. And that basically means that, 90% of all of the scores that were for that given, for this it's 3 years, but for your given test year, that's 90% of people are scoring equal or less than you. So it's depending on, where you want to fall percentile, then you can base your goals off that. And next slide. The kind of goal that you should be hitting for your score depends on where you want to go, like what specific medical school you actually want to attend. So you can kind of go to their webpage, consult what matriculant data they have. Or it also depends on, if you're wanting to do an MD, PhD, you've got to kind of hit that higher mark because it is a bit more competitive. So you can see here those arrows. It says 511 to 521 typically for matriculated MD, PhD, a little bit lower, 505 to 518 for MD, and then a bit lower for DO schools. So.
This is the mean plus or minus the standard deviation. So that's like the realm that you want to score in to be safe. If you score outside of the standard deviation, it's not the end of the world, but you're going to have to make up for it in some other aspect of your application, like your research or your clinical volunteering or your GPA. It is a holistic review to an extent. Next, we're going to cover some prereqs.
Yeah, so I'll be talking about the prereqs. Was there any question about the previous part? Feel free to drop it in the chat as well, and we can answer as we go. That's fine. But we can move on to the next slide. So these are some prerequisite classes. One thing that people wonder is, do I have to take all of these classes for the MCAT? The answer is no. The MCAT is focused more on breadth rather than depth. However, you'll probably end up taking most, if not all of these classes because they are common pre-med prerequisites for medical schools. So just going through these, you can see there's a general chemistry section, 142 to 152 and 162. Most of the material you learn in 142 and 152 is what you'll see on the MCAT. I don't think 162 is as applicable. Then there's OChem, very fun sequence. There's Chem 237, 238, and 239.
Where are they getting these numbers from?
Sorry.
Where are we getting these numbers from?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh,
These are the classes for the University of Washington. So if you don't go there, these might not be as applicable for you. Yeah. But I don't remember off the top of my head what the prereqs are for medical schools, but since UW is in a quarter system, you can just kind of try and translate this over to your school as well. Then there's the physics sequence, there's the algebra-based and calculus-based. I would say the algebra-based is pretty useful, mostly 114, when you learn about kinematics and things like that. For the MCAT, calculus-based, it's not really too relevant to the MCAT or to pre-med in general. You should take it if your major requires it, or if you really have a deep interest in it. But otherwise, if you're pre-med, I would recommend sticking with algebra-based. It'll save your GPA as well. Then there's the biology and biochemistry sections. For biology, I would say all three sections are more or less useful because in all three sections, you learn how to read scientific literature, do that kind of critical thinking that's important in biology. And you'll get a lot of that in the MCAT when you have to do passage-based questions. And then there's biochemistry. You can see there's two options here. For the biochem majors, they usually take Bio C 440, and for everybody else, you take 405 and 406. I recommend taking whichever one is relevant for you. So if you're the major and you have to take it, take 440. Otherwise, just stick with 405 and 406. So I do have a question. If you want to double major in bio and biochem, you had to take the physics calc series. Does anyone know? So,
I double majored in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology and biochem, and you do not need to take the calculus-based series. The chemistry department recommends it, and that's what I did, but it's not worth it. Don't do it. It's going to tank your GPA. Honestly, the algebra base is all you need, and unless you're a huge physics nerd or you're in something like bioengineering, which requires it, I think the calculus based should be optional.
Yep. Usually engineering students are the ones who have to take calc-based physics.
Yeah.
So going back to that, I took 405, 406. I thought both were relevant because in both classes you learn about various biochemical processes in the body, like TCA cycle and things like that, which you'll cover again on the MCAT. And then there's psychology and sociology. So you don't really need to take either for the MCAT because the psychology and sociology sections on the MCAT are pretty content memorization based. Whereas these classes, you'll just be double covering it in a way, I guess. I do recommend still taking them though, because a lot of medical schools these days want you to have a bit more of the experience of the humanities and the social sciences. So I recommend taking them. Pretty easy classes. Yeah, that's it for prereqs.
All right. Now we're going to move on to study resources. If we have any more questions, feel free to shout them out or type them in the chat before we move on. Otherwise, we're going to move on to a whole lot of resources. And before we do that, we want to kind of organize how we used our resource. So can we each go through what what we did in terms of studying?
Sure, so I'll start. I use the Kaplan Books for all of my content review. And then if I saw the need for flashcards, I kind of self-made flashcards. So that was mostly for physics equations. And then for the whole psychology, sociology section, I made all my own flashcards. And then I did the Kaplan practice tests that came with the Kaplan Books. And then I switched to the AMC practice tests kind of near the end of my study before I took the real exam. That way, the most representative exam materials were what I did right before the real one.
So I can go next. My studying was done over 2 months, so I decided to use the Kaplan books. I felt like they were pretty content heavy. So if you wanted to make sure you got a good wide coverage of all the material, I feel like the Kaplan books are a good choice. I went through all the chapters. However, I would take the quiz at the end of each chapter first. And if I did like pretty well on it, I would go to the chapter a bit faster. And if I didn't do well, I'd spend more time on it. And then while I was doing that, I was also going through pre-made Anki decks. We'll cover those later. Daniel will. He'll explain what Anki is. I feel like these decks are pretty useful. I decided not to make my own because of the limited time. But I went pretty quick through the content review, and then I got to UWorld, which is where I spent a lot of my time. It's a lot of practice problems, things like that. Again, Daniel will cover that. And then I ended up only doing AAMC practice tests, and I did most of their practice material, like their section banks and question packs and things like that.
All right. So I use the Kaplan books as well. They're very common, and I think they're pretty useful for getting the content down. I also used Anki Decks, which is like a flashcard app. I also use UWorld, which I think is the best resource outside of the official AAMC practice material. It is so useful. I didn't use Kaplan's practice tests. I found that they were a little bit memorization heavy. So I ended up using something called Blueprint Practice Exams, which has it's a harder version of the AAMC practice material, but it really prepares you well. And then, of course, I used the official AAMC practice material. So moving on, here are the Kaplan books. First of all, I recommend buying them used because you can find them on like Amazon or Craigslist or eBay for like $20, $20 to $60. It's really helpful to just buy them used. You can buy them new if you want Kaplan's practice exams. It costs $175. So a little money to buy new books. I think it's worth it to just buy used. We have a question.
I'd like to actually, add something in. I think that we have a question that kind of relates to buying books used versus new. So all of the Kaplan books, they come out with a version, I think, every year or so. And it really is just reformatting the same material. And so there is kind of no like expiration on buying the books or buying them used, kind of using old ones. They're pretty much the same, got the same content. It's just kind of mixed around. So you're welcome to buy early and kind of start seeing what you're going to need to know for the MCAT. But I would recommend kind of holding off on getting resources until you're really starting to prep, because potentially, a couple of years down the line, there might be something, better than what's out there now, like better than UWorld. I can't imagine that would happen, but it's possible. So I wouldn't spend the money up front until you're ready to really dive in.
Yeah, and I saw another question about the $300 price tag one. So you might have seen that on the Kaplan site. That includes a few more practice tests, and I believe their question bank as well. So if that's something you want, you can spend the extra money on that. But otherwise, if you're just looking for the books, you can usually snag them at 170 or less.
We will cover the AAMC practice material later. They are on our schedule. Oh yeah, they're not free. We'll get into fee assistance if you need it, but they are not free. AAMC loves their money. So you will learn that very fast. It costs a lot of money to take this test, fortunately. So here are some of my rankings of the Kaplan books. So biology, I think it's the best. Like everything in this book, I think is relevant. Next, biochemistry, I gave it a 4.5, and OChem a 4.5. I think this is very relevant, but sometimes Kaplan gets a little bit too detail-oriented, and it goes beyond the scope of the MCAT. This is even more true in the general chemistry and the physics section, where they get off topic frequently, and then they say at the very end of the chapter, but this is beyond the scope of the MCAT. And then you're like, oh, why the heck did I read that then? But behavioral sciences, I felt was a little bit disorganized. I think there's a better resource out there. And cars, I didn't use. I have strong opinions about cars, but I'm the least, I guess, I have the least authority about talking about cars. It's my worst section. I think there are better materials for studying cars than Kaplan. Kaplan's is not representative of the real thing. I barely recognized it from going from the real thing to Kaplan. But we will talk about cars, trust me. I have a lot of experience with cars. Content review. So there's this app that you can put on your phone or your PC or your Mac. It costs like $2 if you have like an iOS device. And here are some helpful links for some pre-made decks. I used the Mile Down deck. Munif, you used the Cubine deck, right?
Yeah, I used Mile Down and Cubine. Cubine for psychology and sociology, Mile Down for everything else. I didn't notice too much of a difference, but people do recommend the Cubine one for psychology, sociology.
And then the physics equations, which is really helpful. Joey, we are recording this and it's going to be on our YouTube channel, so no worry if you have to leave. Next, practice problems. So these are practice tests. I recommend Blueprint. It costs $99 for 4 full-length practice tests. And I think this is actually harder than the real exam, but it really prepares you, especially for like chemistry and physics, because that section is really hard. And I almost never finished a chemistry section on time when I took the Blueprint exams. But on the real test, I finished with 10 minutes to spare. So they really grind a lot of that like hard mentality into you for chemistry and physics. And also for UWorld. So I think this is the best resources outside of the AAMC practice material. It costs a lot of money, and I'm not sure if there's a free way of getting that. But like once you start to see the problems and their godlike explanations, you will appreciate UWorld. They explain the topics better than pretty much anyone, including the AAMC. So I strongly recommend UWorld. Next up, the AAMC material. So this is the most representative of the real test because they're actually using material that they took from previous tests. So all of this can be seen, and it often will be. We have 5 full-length tests. We would all recommend saving them for last because you want to be preparing for the most. You want to be saving the most representative material right before you take the real exam. There's a lot of practice problems outside of the full-length tests. If you want to dig through those, I recommend them. The cars section on the AAMC is the hardest thing you will ever see. I guarantee it. It is, especially like the first, it's called a Q pack. The first question pack of cars will destroy you, but it's okay. Just persevere, learn from your mistakes, and it's really good practice, even though it's really hard. Here's a link to the AAMC store. It costs $268 for the practice materials, and a whopping $300 to register for the test. If you are underprivileged, I believe there is a fee assistance program, so you could get this for free. And I recommend doing that if you fall into that category. But otherwise, you're going to have to dish out a whole lot of money to pay for this test. And last, and probably most important thing, you have to register for the exam early, like a few months early, because these things fill out fast, and you don't want to be caught with no test nearby. And you're ready to take the test, you've studied, and there's no one nearby. I had to drive to Delaware, from DC to Delaware, to take my test. So I recommend registering as early as possible.
If you don't mind me just jumping in for 1 second, the AAMC recently upped their income limits too for the fee assistant. So even if you don't think you qualify, you should still give it a look, because you might.
Deborah, yes. So for the full-length tests, these are like recycled problems from real tests that they actually administered. So they are very representative of what you will see on the real thing. Next, we're going to be moving on to cheat sheets. So these are really helpful for memorization. First, for the chemistry and physics section, we found this list full of equations for chemistry and physics. And I want to emphasize using this as a handicap before you have everything memorized, because I think this is like a 7-page document. You're not going to have it memorized for a long time. So I'll print this out and use it as a handicap when I first started taking practice material. And then over time, I would wean myself off of it. So by the time I was taking like AAMC practice material, I was almost weaned completely off of the equation sheet and had everything memorized. I say that here, memorized. It's important to realize that you don't get a calculator on this exam. And there are things like logarithms that you have to do in your head. There's a few tricks on how to do that, but you don't want to get caught off guard because you don't have a calculator. You got to practice doing quick estimates in your head. It's important not to get the exact precise right answer, but to get close enough to know what answer is correct. It's a multiple choice exam. You just click the one that looks the most accurate. And lastly, focus on units. So I set up an entire new tab, an entire new column for units, because unit conversions are very common on the chemistry and physics section. You want to be making sure that you keep SI units in mind, because otherwise the AAMC will love to trick you just because of a simple unit mistake. And here's another slide. Yeah, this is really helpful to just learn all the equations. Next up, cars, my favorite section. So I recommend like setting aside time each day, maybe like 10 to 15% of your study time, whether that's like 10 minutes or 30 minutes. But you want to set aside a little bit of your study time every day to practicing cars, because persistency is important, especially if you're not naturally gifted at cars. Like, I'm pretty much illiterate, but I managed to pull off a decent car score after initially failing. So I recommend Jack Weston Daily Cars Passages. That's free. I also found this pirated book from Princeton that we're giving away for free. This has pretty good reviews. So I'd go through this, maybe mix it up, use a different resource every few days. I also recommend Khan Academy Cars Passages. That's also free. Focus on the topic and concluding sentences, because that's often where the main picture is. And also keep in mind transition words, because the AAMC will frequently ask you about the author's opinion. And if they change their mind midway through the passage, you want to take note of that, because it's going to be important. Lastly, for Psychology and sociology, it is very common to use the 300-page or 90-page document from the MCAT Reddit site. We have it linked here. And also the Khan Academy YouTube videos for psychology. This pretty much covers everything you need to know. It's very memorization focused. So the 300-page doc or 90-page doc, supplemented with the Khan Academy videos and Anki, will get you started from pretty much knowing nothing about the psychology and sociology section to being pretty much good in terms of studying. That covers a lot of material. If anyone has any questions before we move on, feel free to ask. But now we're going to talk about study schedules.
So study schedules, there's so much to study. How can you organize it all? And kind of the timeline on when to start and when to start taking tests versus content. So go ahead and go next slide. Just to start, when should you take the MCAT? That depends solely on like when you're wanting to apply to medical school. So if you're planning on applying, say, right after you graduate, you'll probably want to do it the summer before. That way you don't have to be studying while you're doing your applications, while you're finishing up your senior classes. But you know, it just depends on your timeline, depends on what you want to be doing at the same time. These are a couple options we laid out. Oftentimes people study for the 3 months during the summer and take the end of the summer test. So that would be either in end of August or end of September. And that's kind of better for if you're planning on applying the year after. That kind of would be a little bit of a too late score for applying that same year. And so then another option is studying part-time for a little bit longer. So maybe more like 4 to 6 months during the school year and taking more of like a May-June test and then applying that same year that you took it. And then another option is potentially taking a gap year, studying part-time while you're working or doing other activities. So it really just depends on kind of when your goal is for applying. Go ahead and advance slide. So as far as building a study plan, I think this is super important just so that you are prepared once your test date rolls around. So I think number one thing to do is decide when you're wanting to take it based on when you're wanting to apply. And you need to schedule that test date. And for this year, like I mentioned earlier, there's a couple different registration dates. I believe it is mid-February for the April, May, and June test dates. And then I think it is May registration for July, August, September. So first thing to do, schedule your test date and then decide how many hours you're going to put into studying. Typically, that's around 200 to 300 hours that you completely put in before you take the MCAT. And then deciding how many hours you're able to study per week. If you have a part-time job, if you are working full-time, how many hours are you really realistically able to put into it? And then take a look at your calendar, mark off days that you're busy, and really just decide when you're going to be wanting to be done with content, starting your practice problems on UWorld, and then starting practice exams. I think that the most important thing is getting practice exams early and often, and then kind of switching to the AAMC practice tests like we mentioned. And usually people do practice tests on Saturdays because that's a large chunk of time that you can sit down and kind of replicate that study environment, and then typically reviewing the day after, because the review is really where you get to see what you made mistakes on and what you need to focus on to get better. And then I linked a free resource on the bottom of the last one that Blueprint has that just helps with building a study plan. You don't have to go by what they say and you don't have to buy their material, but they do have just a free resource that kind of helps you outline it. So, are you guys hearing my cat? Is that why you're laughing in the background?
Yes.
I'm sorry. The door is
awesome.
shut. All right, so maybe you can talk about the
Okay. So I created this little graphic for how you should budget your study time. So content review, that's usually referring to like the Kaplan books. And you're on a small amount of practice problems from UWorld. And then once you wean off the content review in your first month, so the time scale for this is like 3 months. You could shorten it or lengthen it depending on your schedule. Then you move on to UWorld. And then you could reference stuff in the books in this small sliver of time for content review. And then you wean off UWorld into AAMC material, which will take you a while. There's a lot of it. And like I said, if you're not naturally gifted at cars, you should be budgeting some time each day to practice cars. It's something that you have to build up over time if you're not naturally gifted at it. So that's what I recommend. However, if you are naturally gifted at it, you can just kind of get rid of this or minimize it. So Munif and Madeline are cars gods, and they didn't do nearly as much cars practice as I did, and they still scored better in cars than what I did. So it depends. Like cars is something that you're either born with or you have to practice a lot. And I put in some black bars here for full-length practice tests. Generally, these will take you 2 days. 1 day to take a test, 1 day to review it. And yes, 1 whole day to review a test. Reviewing is very important. And you don't have to do the exact amount here. I recommend taking 1 at the very beginning of your studying, just to kind of shell shock you into like, oh my God, I got to study. And then taking them like once a week, maybe once every other week, until you get to your exam date. Also linked in this PowerPoint is an Excel doc that will help you keep track of all your mistakes on your practice exams. So this is one of the most important things you could do, but you need to keep track of your mistakes. So in this Excel doc, there's this tab called correct, and you fill it out whether you got it correct or whether you got it wrong. And then you fill out some content types. So what did you miss? Is it a hybridization problem, mechanics, and then what you learned and why you got it wrong. And over time, you will start to see a pattern. For example, in biology, I always miss problems regarding the kidneys. There's something called the nephron, and you have to know its structure. And I would always get these questions wrong. So I made sure to go back, watch some like Khan Academy videos, review the Kaplan books, and put time into your mistakes. I know it feels bad, like focusing on what you're not good at, but unless you address what you're getting wrong, your score will plateau and you will not improve. You'll just sit at the same score and just keep studying and not improve, which is even more frustrating. So you got to address your weaknesses. Oh yeah, we're going to be talking about burnout later. So we'll address that. Actually, I think we're getting into that right now.
All right. Is there any questions from the last section? Anyone wants to? All right. So taking the exam, we just got a question about burnout and related to MCAT studying and how can we balance all of this while still studying for the test and putting time into the mistakes and all of that. So we will get into kind of some tips for that. So go ahead and advance. So I think it's really important to schedule rewards and schedule free time. When you're studying for the MCAT, any time that you're not studying, you feel like you could be doing something productive and you kind of feel guilty. And so I think it's important to set blocks of time where you can guilt-free do whatever you want, put in free time into your schedule, put in rewards into your schedule. And then also if you're, needing to take a break, but you still want to be productive, get your life together, make a meal, call your friends, call your family, because that is really going to make these couple months of really intense studying just so much better. And then another fun thing to do is if you have someone who's also studying for the MCAT, you can sometimes either go over questions or decide if you want to like review a whole exam together, then you can really solidify your understanding, but also still have, contact with others while studying this terribly long and tough test. So those are just some things to think about. And then another thing to think about is you want to practice how you're going to be taking your exam. So you're going to take your full length practice exams under semi-realistic conditions just to kind of prepare your body for sitting in a chair with a screen for 7.5 hours straight. So you want to take your exams in a quiet space with minimal distractions. You kind of want to take breaks at each interval and potentially, eat a similar snack as to what you're planning on eating, just so that your body kind of understands, a banana is going to give you mental energy. And then on the test day, you've got that same connection. And then another thing is regulating your sleep and study schedule. I mentioned this earlier, but if you're a morning person, really try to schedule one of those morning exam times, because that's when you're going to be used to studying and you're going to be used to working your brain. Versus if you're a night owl, maybe try to get a PM time, because that is going to be ending kind of around 10 o'clock in the night at the test center. So I would not suggest that if you're a morning person. Go ahead and advance. And then some things to do to minimize your stress before actually taking the test. We kind of all agreed that driving to your test center beforehand can really minimize your distraction and your stress on the day. That way you know exactly where you need to be, you know exactly how long it's going to take you to get there. Maybe you'll know exactly how much traffic to expect on your route. So that's super important. And especially like Daniel said, he had to drive, to a different state in order to take his test. Not ideal, but you do want to know where it is. You want to know, plan in advance for pickups with your ride, etc. So that's a really good one. And then make a list of what you're going to bring and what you're going to wear, because those exam rooms, it does get cold. They don't want you, you can't have extra jewelry. You can't have like all these things. And so just be sure in what you're going to bring, be sure in what you're going to wear. And then that way, when it comes to the day, you don't have to think about it at all in the morning. And then let's see, double check the date and time of your test. That's super important. You don't want to get that wrong come the day. So make sure to do that, before your exam. And then again, schedule something fun for afterward, because you just completed a, potentially 3 to 6 month feat of memorization. So you're going to need something to look forward to push you through that day.
So I can go over this part. So the actual exam day, don't study anymore, especially right before the test. Cramming does not help. So just go in with, you'll know what you know, and just try to use that as a motivator of, you practice so hard, and after this test, you can finally relax. Again, only take with you food, water, medication, and you'll need your government issued ID, has your name on it. Make sure that ID, the name on there matches the name on your MCAT registration. If it does not, you won't be allowed to take the test. So that's very important. A quick thing I want to mention is what's voiding. A lot of people actually don't know what this is, and then when they run into it during the test, it sort of might throw people off a bit. So at the end of the MCAT test, you can actually void your score. So the MCAT you took, it will be, it won't count. Medical schools won't even know that you took it or anything like that. So this can kind of throw people off a bit, because you might not feel too good after you took it or something like that. The chances are, unless you feel really bad, like you feel like you didn't practice at all, and you large section of the test you didn't know how to do, you probably want to avoid voiding it. You probably did better than you think, or you did what you did on the practice exams. And finally, the score is usually released in 4 weeks. Right now, for COVID, it's a little faster. I believe it's 2 weeks, but it will go back to 4 weeks in a few months. So keep that in mind, especially if you're taking your MCAT pretty close to the date when you submit your applications for medical school.
All right. So thank you for helping answer questions while we're going. Any more questions that people want to ask before we get to our last section? All right. So the last section is getting results. So like Munif said, it's usually like a 1 month turnaround time, which is a lot. They could grade it faster than that, but they make you wait and make you suffer because that's what AAMC likes to do. First, congrats on completing the test. This is a big accomplishment. Next, we're going to cover assessing your score and whether or not you should retake. So real quick, I want to mention that med schools can see everything about your score. They just don't see your cumulative exam score. They see every section. And I can also see how many times you took the test if you want to retake. Usually this isn't a problem because the majority of med schools will look at only your highest score. So even if they see that you took the exam multiple times, they'll only consider your highest score, which is good. Now you want to consider that though, because I recommend against retaking the exam right after you get the exam back, because that's often too early for you to learn what your mistakes were. And then you can perform the exact same and get the exact same test score, and that doesn't look good. If you are going to retake, make sure to kill it. Make sure to come back and raise your score, because that's what med schools like to see if you retake. So this section will probably have your heart beating at 1,000,000 times per second. It's going to make your heart feel like it's going to explode when you open the score. But this is what the score breakdown looks like. And I mentioned early on in the presentation that I had a retake, and this is why. Do you notice anything, a little bit of an outlier here? It's the cars section. So 35th percentile. So fun fact, Canadian med schools screen heavily on cars, and med schools could screen based on individual sections. So I reached out to some med schools, and it wasn't a problem at every single med school. Keep in mind that this overall score of 512 is pretty damn good. So if I got a balanced score, I probably would have kept this because it takes a lot of time to retake. However, because cars was so low, after talking to some med schools, some said it was okay, some said it wasn't. I decided to retake once the pandemic hit, and I spent a lot of time practicing cars in order to raise it up. Real quick, this was me trying to cram for this exam. Do not try to cram for it. I think I studied in like a month, and this was like after I graduated, and trying to move from Seattle to DC, it was a mess. So I don't recommend, trying to cram for this exam. It won't work. You also want to consider where you want to apply. So if you are thinking about retaking, consider your school list. If your school list looks like Harvard and Stanford and UCLA and University of Michigan and Duke, which is what my school list looks like, because I'm an MD PhD applicant. I'm going to be an MD PhD applicant, and a lot of that school making decision process is based on what PIs you like. If you see someone like a research mentor that you really like, you apply to that school. And a lot of my research mentors are at places like UCLA and San Diego and all these competitive places. So you have to consider where you want to apply. Retake if your score is significantly below your target schools. Med schools have a holistic review process, but I will mention to an extent. There is a level beyond return, basically, that will tank your application. So, for example, if you are an MD PhD applicant and you score below a 500 on the MCAT, your application is likely tanked. Like, you won't get anywhere. I don't want to scare you, but that's the reality of it. So you have to consider it's holistic, but to an extent. If you score a few points below the average, no big deal. If you score below a critical threshold, you'll want to retake. And again, study your mistakes and weaknesses, because that's what's going to get your score up. Don't try to rush and cram for this test. If you don't notice an improvement in your score, change how you're studying. Because you don't notice an improvement, but you're sitting and spending hours studying, well, it's not working. So change up how you're studying. And this is what I was able to do when I actually took the time and took maybe 4 to 5 months part-time of studying and really putting a lot of effort into cars. And I actually ended up raising every section, which I didn't expect. But now I took my score from being a good score, a good but unbalanced score, to being competitive at places like UCLA and places like that. So in my mind, it was worth it, especially because it was the lockdown, didn't have a lot of stuff to do, so it was worth it. But consider that it does take a lot of time to study for this test. Consider if that's the time well spent retaking. You want to make sure it's worth it. And lastly, this is the end slide. If you have any questions, feel free to email us and look us up on LinkedIn. This end slide and the slides for this presentation will all be sent out so people can have everything linked in this presentation. Does anyone have any questions? We're kind of just opening up the floor right now. Feel free to speak up or chat.
There's my cat.
What species is that?
It's a Devon Rex. They look kind of like aliens, but they're like the cuddliest hypoallergenic cat that exists. So yeah, fun fact.
Well, that's good. That's hypoallergenic.
It does have Siamese coloring for that person that asked. It's not a Siamese cat, but it's got the color pattern. He's like a regal looking.
He looks very
all right, any
in
real
that picture.
MCAT questions? You'd have upper division. Oh yeah, if you ever take upper division bio or chemistry, I have a minor in chemistry, so I took a bunch of upper chemistry as well. You guys can email questions. I don't specifically have any tips to give now, but if you have specific questions.
I took a lot of microbiology and global health classes, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that.
I took a lot of upper division chemistry classes, like PChem, which I don't recommend. If you're a biochem major, you're going to have to take it. But there's a lot of stuff in the biology major that's really interesting. Things that you wouldn't even expect, like paleontology. I mean, a lot of the teachers are pretty fun, and neurobiology. Those classes are all pretty interesting. How long did you wait between taking prereqs and taking the MCAT? This is a good question because I waited until my gap years, which I don't recommend because you're going to be struggling to remember all that gen chem nonsense and all that like intro bio stuff, and you're going to be like, holy crap, I haven't seen this in 4 years. But then again, I discovered medicine quite late. So I would recommend, I think when you're most prepared regarding prereqs is like sometime in your junior year, maybe a little bit before that if you're ahead on schedule. But your junior year is a pretty damn good time where all your prereqs are fresh in your head, all that content is fresh, and you're able to go into the exam and spend really minimize the time just refreshing all that stuff that you learned in freshman year and stuff.
I'd love to say something on this as well. It also just depends on when you're planning on applying. Junior year is a great time. I took it summer of my junior year when I was working part-time in a lab on campus, and then I studied part-time for the MCAT and took it the end of the summer, and that worked excellent. It was fresh in my mind, but I had planned on applying earlier to med school. And so I applied this year with my MCAT score, but if I am gonna need to reapply to medical school, I will have to retake the MCAT because my 3-year exam will have expired. So that is something to think about as well. If you want to take a gap year, maybe take it senior year, not junior year, just so that you have that ability to reapply without retaking. So something to think about. And then I'm seeing a question on, would you recommend taking a quarter off to prepare for the MCAT? I don't personally know anybody who took time off school to prepare for the MCAT. I think the best way to do that maybe is to just study during the summer. That way you're not, unless you're taking summer classes, but maybe don't take summer classes, study in the summer when you either have a job or have a bit extra free time.
Yeah, if you try to take like autumn, winter, spring off, especially with upper division courses, it can kind of mess up your schedule. So I also recommend taking it during the summer if you can.
I've met a few people who have studied during the quarter, and what they typically do is take an easier course load. Don't load up on 15 plus credits. Go like 12 credits, manageable classes, stuff like, psychology and sociology, some like filler courses. No offense if you're taking these, but they are less demanding than things like biochem. So go a little bit easy on your course schedule, and I think you could manage to part-time study. Do I recommend a course? I don't. I do not recommend a course. It's a waste of money. I'm using strong words here, but like a course will cost you like over $1,500. Like, unless you want to dish out like over $1,000 for a course. And that's usually because people take courses because they can't manage their time when they're studying. But as long as you kind of keep a schedule, if you're able to like manage your time and craft your own schedule, then I don't think a course is necessary. And it's going to cost a whole lot of money. Like you could easily dish out over $2,000 for this test, and that's not worth it. Especially if you could figure out like a good study method that works for you.
Yeah, I would say only take a course if you don't trust yourself sticking to the schedule. Because I've had some friends who've taken courses and they really liked it. It didn't really teach them much more than studying on their own, but it helped them stay committed. So if you do need it, then it might be worth it. But that's a decision that only you can make, obviously.
There's a question about double majors. So I don't think double majors really add anything in terms of like how good you look. It looks much better to have a high GPA in one major than it is to load up on a ton of majors and get a bunch of classes but have a lower GPA. So if you want a double major and you are confident that you could keep your GPA up, go for it. I managed to double major, and I was originally just a biochem major, and I added biology, and it actually helped me because a lot of the biology classes are graded easier than the chemistry department. So only double major if you're confident that you can manage your course load. But I don't think there's a competitive advantage versus double major or single major given the same GPA. The real benefit of double majoring is learning unique skills that major offers, like microbiology techniques, biochemistry techniques. Maybe you want to get into mathematics or stuff like that. I mean, those are useful skills.
Yeah, I think also I kind of put this in the comments, but if you're majoring in one of the sciences and you're taking all of the prereqs for medical school, it's pretty easily done to either add another major or get a minor because you already have taken so many science courses. So for example, I majored in bio, but I only needed 2 extra chemistry classes to get the minor. And so I think that I was interested in gaining those chemistry skills, like lab skills, and that honestly helped get my lab job and then, jobs after college. So I think it's important to kind of gain those skills, but also like if you're already almost, able to complete a minor, why not? it can't hurt unless it's hurting your GPA, then maybe don't do it. But yeah.
Same thing for me. I majored in microbiology, but I only had to do 3 more classes to also major in MCD. And it turned out to be beneficial because 2 of those professors became my letter writers. So it doesn't hurt. It's nice to get outside your major too.
Are there any more questions? Going once, going twice.
I had a quick question.
Oh yeah.
So I know we talked about like the prereqs for like OChem and like physics. So question I had was like, do you think it's like necessary to like complete the entire series before like taking the MCAT? Or like, do you think it's fine, like, let's say like you just did physics 121 and 122 and decided not to take 123 and start studying for the MCAT? Like, does the extra like last sequence or like finishing, like not finishing entire sequence, do you think that matters at all?
I think it's totally fine. If you
Okay.
especially if you're taking the calculus-based series.
Yeah.
I would say if you've covered, at least like Chem 142, OChem 237, gone a bit into bio, you can pretty much study the rest on your own because like you will be doing a lot of content review. And if you do things like UWorld, you'll cover all that again.
Okay.
And the class just goes so deep into the topics that the MCAT doesn't cover a lot of that.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And also, for example, OChem classes, you either love them or you hate them. Personally, I absolutely hated them. And on OChem tests, you have to draw the diagrams, you have to do arrow pushing, all of that. Just keep in mind that this is a multiple choice test and it is super broad, but so shallow. So there's not too much they can really test you on with those upper level, the higher, or I guess the later series classes.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good point because I see a lot of pre-meds wasting their time drawing out every single like metabolite. It's not helpful. Like, why would you need to draw out the structure of succinate on the exam? You got to recognize it. So it's a recognition-based test. You got to recognize your amino acids, but you don't have to like waste time drawing things out and doing all this stuff. I think that's unnecessary. And also for the classes, if you're partway through Gen Chem, I think that's fine. If you're partway through OChem, I only think like the first class is necessary for the MCAT. Partway through physics, I think only like the first classes are necessary. For biology though, it might be a good thing to be enrolled in 220 or complete 220. Because I remember 220 having like some heart physiology, and that's really important. Physiology is pretty heavily tested on the MCAT, so like lungs, heart, digestive system, and that's all covered in 220. And also, if you can manage to take biochemistry or are currently enrolled in biochemistry, I think that is a great way to boost your grade. Biochemistry is one of those things that's really hard to study with no background knowledge. So if you're currently enrolled or if you've completed one of these classes, it's really going to help. In my real exam, I would estimate half of the CP section was biochemistry and half of the biology section was also biochemistry. It was a ton. So I think they're weighting it heavier. At least that's what I felt. I think biochemistry is definitely a big yield topic.
Okay, thank you.
Question from Patsy. Would you recommend taking prereq courses if we didn't get a decent grade in them? Retaking the course?
Sometimes. It's such, I don't know how other schools do it, but for UW, I'm pretty sure if you retake that course, your other grade still goes into your grade point calculation. So like, if you retake it and you don't do that good again, then you're really just screwing yourself because that's double counting against your GPA twice, where it's like, I didn't get a great OChem grade in the second, then third one. And I knew that if I retook it, like I was probably going to do better, but still not great. And I just decided to take the L once rather than twice because it will both go into that GPA. So that's a tough question. I think it depends on where exactly you're sitting for like what is a decent grade. You know, I guess that's important.
I would say only retake it if you failed. Otherwise, focus on having an upward trajectory instead.
Yeah.
Agreed. I thought about retaking Physics 122 because I got absolutely decimated by that class. I didn't fail, but it was low. And I had a counselor just tell me, just move on, because if you retake, I think they average it, right? They average your previous score, which is bad, and your next score, which might as well be bad as well if it's a subject that you struggle with. So I don't think it's worth it unless you failed. Does it matter if we take courses outside of the Seattle campus? I don't think so. That's it. I think we'll be heading out. Thank you for everyone for coming, and huge thank you to Madeline and Munif for helping me make this presentation, present this. They offered a lot of help and presented it in a very professional way. So thank you. Peace, everyone.
All right. Bye. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.